Welcome to this week's edition of Unvarnished Football. I'm Michael Jackson of the Game Before the Money. With me, Upton Bell, former executive with the Baltimore Colts, former general manager with the New England Patriots, and former owner of the World Football League Charlotte Hornets. His father, Burt Bell, was NFL commissioner in the 1950s and 1940s and founded the Philadelphia Eagles. So if you wonder where the Eagles got their name, it's from Upton's dad. And we're going to jump right in with some breaking news. Kirk Cousins signing with the Raiders. And both Upton and I still think of them as the Oakland Raiders because we're old school like that. But he's signing with the Raiders ostensibly to mentor Fernando Mendoza, who will, by all signs, be drafted by the Raiders as the number one overall pick. Upton, what do you think of the idea of signing somebody like Kirk Cousins to mentor a rookie quarterback?
I like it very much. And by the way, as I was telling you before the start of the show, yesterday I had the whole workout with Mendoza at his school at Indiana, and I mean there were more people at that than filming of Ben Hur and the chariot race. You couldn't believe it. It was wall to wall people. Michael, they had 10, count it, 10 coaches from we like to call it Oakland, from Las Vegas there from the Raiders to watch his workout. And I can tell you this, I actually tweeted out after it was over. I said, this guy is, and I hate to use the word can't miss, but he can't miss. He's big, he's strong, he's quick, he's in command of everything. He made every throw, short, long. I mean, almost picture perfect and everything that he really did. And then I listened to his interview afterwards, and this is a very self-assured, not overly cocky, but very self-assured player that I really felt if this was the only thing that they were going to go with the Raiders, because I think their team stinks, that hopefully that he would remain in one piece, but he would be very welcoming into anybody's huddle. Very, very, very self assured. And it's funny because they talked to a lot of the scouts and people afterwards. This is on ESPN, and everybody was of the same mind that this guy, barring injury, of course, is really can't miss. Now, the backstory on the Falcons is they sign Cousins, and then they draft Michael Penix, and Cousins is like going to himself, what the hell do they do this for? And I do know this, and they were talking about it today, some of the experts on ESPN, that Cousins never took to Penix and never did anything to help Penix one way or another. I never understood why they drafted Penix anyway. But that being said, that they all said, which I believe to be true, that the Raiders wouldn't have signed this guy if he wasn't somebody that they thought would actually work with Mendoza. And that's the thing that I think that they got out of Cousins, that he would definitely work with him, because there's no way you're going to sign somebody. You're not going to throw Mendoza to the wolves, and that's the first thing that I really thought about it when they decided that they were going to draft him, which was pretty evident. But they better find somebody that is willing to take the beating with that team and also would mentor him. And in the case of Atlanta, Cousins wouldn't do that with Penix.
Yeah, that's
And
really interesting to hear that. Um, and
that's a true story.
yeah, well, that's interesting to hear that. And then the Raiders signing Cousins. I mean, unless they've talked to him, what's the guarantee? I mean, I've watched Kirk Cousins. Um, going back to Michigan State, I'm a Big Ten fan. I grew up in a Big Ten city. I always thought, Kirk Cousins was kind of. I always considered him kind of a gnat. he like always hung around. He was scrappy as all get up. Really upsetting if you're. He's like a mosquito. If you're a fan of the other team, it's like the guy just won't go away. He just kind of keeps his team in games, and you know, if that's something that he can pass along to somebody else, but also, maybe he's highly competitive within the organization as well. Maybe he's like, hey, this Michael Penix kid is trying to take my job. Why should I be helping him out? There are people who think like that too.
Well, look at his career. I mean, he really. I mean, when you think back to the magical days of RG3, when he first came to the Redskins, and he was going to be the hero, and he was really great, athletic, till he got hurt, and then Cousins steps in, and it always seemed like wherever Cousins went, it was like, well, we're still looking for somebody else, and and I think he's been much underrated. I think he's a very good quarterback. I mean, when you really think about it, Michael, how many really great quarterbacks are there in the NFL, or have there been? Uh, he's not a great quarterback, but I think when he's finished playing, you'll look back and say he's been very good wherever he's been.
Well,
I
I
mean,
I remember when he went to the Vikings, and I was like, oh no, I got to put up with this guy again. As a Packer fan, because
uh,
if you're a fan of the team he's playing against, he's very annoying. In that he is such a scrappy dude, but he's a guy that you'd want on your team. Um, because he does have that chip on his shoulder, it seems, or he's just kind of scrappy, and he punches above his weight. That's kind of a cliche that gets overused, but that's kind of how I've always seen Kirk Cousins, and I've always thought of him as better than everybody's giving him credit for. Also, I mean, there was a brief year or two where he was kind of a media darling, people predicting him to win MVP and that sort of thing. Um, but really, yeah, he generally is overlooked because he's not an A line, you know, Aaron Rodgers in his prime, Tom Brady, Peyton Manning. He was never going to be that level. But there are some great quarterbacks in history who haven't been the headliner, who have been really, really good quarterbacks who have taken their teams, pretty far in the playoffs. I mean, we saw that this year with Sam Darnold, um, and the guy I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Um, I don't know why he's popping in my head, but a guy you saw a lot in New England, Steve Grogan. That was a guy who's not
oh, you know what?
gonna.
If he didn't, if he didn't get hurt, because I saw his whole career. If Steve Grogan didn't get hurt, I think he would be mentioned as a possibility for the Hall of Fame. He was one of the first. And remember, they let Plunkett go. And Plunkett had been injured, and I mean, I was here for part of it. I mean, disastrous offensive lines. But for Grogan, and I remember talking to Peter Hadhazy, who had, once I was fired, had taken over kind of as the assistant general manager of Chuck Fairfax. And he said, I remember him calling me and saying, this kid's going to be great. He said, particularly because he's really a very good runner. He had a terrific arm. And I mean, he was injured off and on many times because he was one of the first real runners in the NFL besides being a thrower. But I mean, that brings up another point. Uh, when you talk about the Vikings, look at how many screw ups that they have had where they let quarterbacks go or sign someplace else. And where are they now? Tua Tagovailoa is now the guy that might end up being their starting quarterback because the quarterback they drafted, I don't think is the answer, but they keep letting people go, and and
Well, they let Sam Darnold go. They let Kirk Cousins go. And they've got a history of doing this. They let Rich Gannon go. What does he do? He wins MVP. He leads the Raiders to the Super Bowl. They let Fran Tarkenton go, and what do? They got to trade for him back with the Giants. They've done that. They've done that their entire history. Um, kind of let go of their starting quarterback. Underrated a lot of times, and then it comes back to bite them.
But you're absolutely right about that. And I kept wondering, I mean, how many people can they keep going through? Because they have a really good football team that probably could have gone to the Super Bowl 2 years ago, but again, they just keep looking for that quarterback, and he's right under their thumb, and they let him go. So I mean, I have no idea, but I do think the other thing that we want to add with the Raiders, even though I think Brady is among the greatest quarterbacks I've seen, I also think he's among the greatest phonies I've seen off the field. And yet with the Raiders, he's trying to play it both ways. He wants to do the radio and television, or he wants to do the television mainly, sell all these products, and then kind of pretend he's not part of the Raiders, but he is part of the Raiders. But the thing that is going to happen is with the quarterback situation, with a young quarterback coming in like this, is that Mendoza will get the benefit, assuming that Brady is going to be there at their training camp and at their early sessions. That if he can bring to his game the work ethic that Brady really had here, which was maniacal, Michael, that's again another help. So Brady could be a positive here as far as having him, and then Cousins. You're going to learn from two of the best. So, barring injury, we always have to say that this kid could really be great.
Yeah, he's set up for success in a lot of ways, and including in his own talent. Um, but every now and again. Now I don't know about Fernando Mendoza, um, how he is. There are
I like
some players who are very receptive to mentorship, and there are other players who are like, no, 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 I got it. That's cool. So there's that variable also. Um, we'll just have to see. There are players who are um, very open to input from former players and current coaches, and there are players who are um, not receptive and who are just going to go in there and do things their own way. Um,
I would say this, Michael, and I think you're right about that. There's a certain type of player. From the interviews I've seen, particularly which was a long interview yesterday, he's all encompassing, and particularly in getting coaching from people. I don't think that's going to be his problem. I'd be very surprised. But you do bring up the point that there's some guys that think, oh, I got it, no matter what the hell it is. And usually they don't work out. But I think this kid has everything going for him. Biggest problem with the Raiders is basically, which is another part of this, is Mark Davis, who I think is not only doesn't have the money that all these other billionaires have, but I question a lot of things about him. But there is supposedly a deal on the table for Brady's buddy, who we kind of wedged in there, who's the next biggest a billionaire owner, to buy out Mark Davis. And I would say the best thing that could happen to the Raiders is to get Mark Davis out of the picture.
well, now this is kind of a similar situation um, to when you took over the Patriots GM job, and Jim Plunkett, first overall draft pick in the draft, Heisman Trophy winner out of Stanford, and the top quarterback prospect out of a group of three of the best quarterback prospects that there had been for a while with Archie Manning and Dan Pastorini. And then you're taking over a team that doesn't have an offensive line, whose owner is kind of questionable skill wise, and there's not any other talent. Now Plunkett, he took a beating in his first few years, and he really, as great as he was, he really didn't get to blossom until he came to the Raiders, um, and won two Super Bowls with the Raiders, because he had such great talent around him. Do you see, what do you see from your experience with the Patriots situation being somewhat similar? In my opinion, maybe you don't see it that way. Let me know. But what do you see with this situation and Mendoza coming in?
Well, the difference is, and again, youth brings on bravado and many other things. Is that I would have said if I knew in advance. See, there wasn't just one owner. There were like three or four owners, and they all seemed to be fighting among each other to a degree. And then there was Billy Sullivan, who was kind of the president or representative of it, that had the smallest amount of ownership. And I never would have walked into a situation uh, if I had known completely. And that's not begging ignorance. I'm just saying what it is. That I never would have done that because you have to walk into a place and be able to control it immediately. The second part of it was Plunkett was coming to a team who had fired their coach the year before and had an interim coach that I didn't feel ever from the beginning to the end was the answer for not only Plunkett but for the team. So there was a constant fighting between myself and the owners to a degree, trying to satisfy them, and then trying to get them the idea that you can't keep this coach and have a person like Plunkett. So he never really had, I think, a chance, as you point out. Our offensive line, I tried to improve. In other words, when I came in here, we signed something like 75 to 100 free agents just for training camp, just to find enough players that could really play with this guy. We had some real talent, and then I made a couple of gambles. One to make a trade with Dallas for Dwayne Thomas, who I felt was the best running back and could have been, the successor to Jim Brown. But he only lasted 2 days because the coach didn't like the idea that he wouldn't get down in like a 3-point stance. So that ended, and then in my second year, I traded with the Giants for Fred Dreyer, who I felt was among the best defensive ends in football. I had already scouted him and Plunkett in college, and again, the owners refused to pay the guy after I agreed to make the deal. I mean, I literally had to call his agent, who I went out to the West Coast to visit with, and actually met Fred. Actually, I said, you got a deal. Now, ready for this? The deal was 1 year with an option at 75,000. That's 1972. I realized, and the owner said that's too much money, so I had to cancel that trade. So, so the bottom line is, a if you're a player, well, you have no choice if you're drafted as a player. But I always thought that Plunkett, and I still do to this day, is a borderline Hall of Fame player, number one. But number two, don't walk into a situation where you really don't, in the end, have any chance. And I would say in the Raiders' case, it's different because there's only one guy, and that is Mark Davis. And if there's a way for the guy, if he's the right type, who knows, to buy him out, then it's a completely different thing. Mark Davis is like somebody who is in the same pool uh, with 31 other billionaires, and they barely break a sweat, whereas he's got to sweat every day with a franchise, whether he can afford it or not. That's the problem.
Now we're talking about your days as a general manager a little bit, and we've been wanting to kind of go in to this topic that which I think you started discussing with either the Athletic or the New York Times had gotten
Yeah,
a
the
hold of
Athletics.
you to discuss the changes in the role of the general manager over time. Let's dig a little bit deeper into that. What did you say in that story, and what would you want to say if the piece was a bigger piece?
Well, Mike Sando was the interviewer, and he does write for the Athletic. And I was telling him he was studying the evolvement of the general manager from back way back to what it is today. And I said a couple of things. I said, first of all, you have to understand that basically, even from the very beginning, there's always a difference between the general manager and the coach. They they they're they don't totally agree on all things, and in other cases, they completely disagree. But that's the push pull that you really need in an organization if it's a healthy push pull. Uh, Going all the way back, let's say into the 50s and 60s, the general manager really under the owner. Now, it all depended on who the owner was. If you let's, and I point out to him, if you're the New York Football Giants, uh, Tim Mara's one of his sons, Wellington Mara, actually was in my opinion, was the general manager. And until his brother Jack died, Jack ran the business. Wellington ran the football part of it. I said Wellington Mara was a Hall of Fame general manager. Actually, even though he didn't have the title, he was an owner. He made some of the best deals. They had some of the best drafts that they've ever had. And then you had different teams. For instance, Pete Rozelle was the general manager, but before him was Tex Schramm of the Rams. Now, Dan Reeves uh, was somewhat of a hands on owner, only in that he was big on scouting, and the Rams probably turned out more top players than any other team in NFL history. And I mean, to the point of where they had to either cut, trade, or find another way to move players because they had so much talent that a lot of their talent ended up with a lot of other teams, including the Cleveland Browns. So you had two really general managers there, and one succeeded the other. The general manager ran everything. Now today it's just way too big. You know, you kind of ran or was in charge of the drafting of players. You did all the signing of players. You were over the ticket office. You were over the PR department. But again, the operation was much smaller, so you could control everything. Even when I came here in 1971, the general manager. I mean, if you wanted to pick one guy that you would say, and Sando actually kind of picked him. Uh, I would say he was right to a degree about it. Was Jim Finks was the ideal general manager that came from Canada. Actually, I saw Jim Finks play for the Pittsburgh Steelers as their quarterback.
There you
Then he
go.
went to then he went to Canada, and he and Bud Grant were like a package that came to the Vikings. And he was a very shrewd, very sharp guy, drafted well, ran his organization really well, and of course, today then went to the Bears and then finished in the New Orleans Saints. But I would say there's your Hall of Fame. If you want a general manager, you say Hall of Fame, you would have Finks, you would have Pete Rozelle, and you'd have Tex Schramm. All three are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But again, things were then much smaller. Now, today, how has it evolved? Well, first and foremost, as the owner of that time, the owners of that time, how many times did you see them either quoted or, or, or see them in their boxes on TV or see them in the locker room? You didn't,
Most
because
people couldn't name the owner.
they couldn't name it.
Like,
And you know
yeah.
what? Most of the owners preferred it that way. Uh, they 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 had their own egos, but remember, in the beginning, many of them struggled. Bert Bell, Art Rooney, the Maras, George Hallis, you name them, Dan Reeves. They all barely kind of made it. The
Oh,
league
Curly
barely.
Lamb. Well, you take Curly
Right.
Lambeau. He had to turn it into a non-profit organization to stay afloat.
That there's another example. The Chicago the Cardinals and the Bears were in the same city together, and Hallis kept trying to figure a way to get rid of them. Uh, and so, I mean that if people could realize what it was really like to struggle to try and make it, and these were guys that if whether you like owners or not, and today's owner is much different in every sport, uh, we kind of admire these guys because they face extinction many times and came through all of this, and yet they're some of them are remembered. People remember George Hallis, but the general manager, they and unless it was Hallis that ran everything, and his son Muggsy Hallis, ran the other part of it, like the business part of it. Art Rooney kind of ran the organization, but another thing is when you do the introductions, a lot of people don't remember that Bert Bell actually sold the Eagles, and he and Art Rooney became partners in the Steelers, 50-50 partners, and he was essentially kind of their general manager. And he kind of worked through the whole thing, and then he became commissioner in 1946. But all of these guys, Art Rooney, as well known as he was in Pittsburgh, how many people knew who the hell Art Rooney was around the country? They didn't know it
Not
because
until the
you know,
70s, you know.
yeah, not till the 70s. All of these people, you wouldn't see like you see with Bob Kraft or other owners. There he is in his box. Now I will say this, and I did tell Sando this. The one legitimate guy, even though I don't agree with anything he does, is Jerry Jones. Because Jerry Jones is the owner, but he is the general manager, and you better believe that. But what I give to Jerry Jones that I don't give to a lot of the other modern day billionaires is Jerry Jones played college football. He knew how to run teams. He knew the game starting as a player on that undefeated Arkansas team, and who was one of his teammates, on that team. So you look at
Jimmy
him,
Johnson
Jimmy
is the
Johnson,
answer to
who
that
he
question.
hired.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I say I don't like the way he runs his team, but I'd say, and he probably over general managers, but he's one of the legitimate people that happens to be a billionaire, but also his roots go back to football. But so now you have huge coaching staffs, you have huge front offices, you have analytics, you have all of these things where basically, I mean, the coaching staff could be up to 20. The front office, I mean, there's so many different parts of it now. What is really the power of the general manager? And I told Sando, you're always going to have that internal conflict between, and it can be good, between a general manager and a coach. The general manager, I remember Pete Rozelle once telling me, Upton remembers something long after the coach is gone, the general manager is there. And that basically that you as a general manager have to think of the overall operation, that the coach only thinks about winning and losing and how to get the proper players. But the general manager has to think for the organization. Is the coach the right coach for the organization? And I thought about that again when I first came to the Patriots. I said, is this coach, which I actually went to the owners and told them in a very tense meeting, I said, we might upset a few teams, which we did that year. We actually beat the Dolphins on the way to the playoffs. We beat the Colts on the last day of the season, which the Patriots owners then said, well, we can't fire him. And I had said 2 weeks before that, I said to them, listen, it's right now we're doing some really good things with Plunkett, but we're not near there. Uh, the question I have is basically, is that coach John Mazer the coach that should be here for the future? If you ask me, I say no, he is not. So if you want to take another year and overrule me, that basically you're putting a year off of the growth of this football team. Was I right?
Exactly.
I was right.
You were
And,
totally right. Yeah, and then they
so,
eventually hired Chuck Fairbanks after you were gone.
well, guess what? They asked me for a list. Sullivan did. I gave them the list and they said, well, who would you prefer? Who would you prefer in the pros, and who would you prefer in the colleges? I said Howard Snellenberger would be my choice, my first choice on Shula's staff as a coach. I knew when he was at Alabama, I liked his ability to coach on college and pro level. He said, "Well, who would be your college coach?" I said, "One or the other, either Joe Paterno or Chuck Fairbanks." And they of course then eventually hired Fairbanks.
And had some
So
great years, great
yeah,
playoff years
but
under
but
Fairbanks.
he right, but he ran into, and he and I talked just before he died at Will McDonough, the great Boston Globe columnist, at his funeral, and I said to Fairbanks, "Well, I guess we both ended up in the same place because he found out what I found out, and I would have probably picked up the phone and told him just be careful, but I didn't know him at all at the time. Is that basically Billy Sullivan promised one thing and did another, and Fairbanks finally had enough of all of it. He would have stayed here, and I believe would have been a Hall of Fame coach, that type of coach. He knew talent. He kept all my people, kept Bucko Kilroy, who was the key to the whole thing. And the reason I hired Kilroy was to build this team. And by the way, he belongs in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But Fairbanks found out what I found out is that basically they can tell you you have all the authority in the world, and then the first time you want to do something, they don't agree. In this case, Sullivan. So he learned the same lesson I did, and unfortunately, he didn't stay here, and then went on and didn't have a lot of success after that. Went to Colorado, and then ironically ended up working for the worst owner of them all, Donald Trump. So the example is the perfect general manager is no longer around. Maybe the closest to it, Michael, would be Harry Roseman of the Philadelphia Eagles. I think he, particularly in this day and age, you have to protect. You have to take a slot. Are you going to be a general manager that hires and fires the players and the coaches and stuff like that? Are you going to be the general manager over the analytics, over the sales department? I mean, it goes on and on and on. Roseman, it appears to me, is really kind of in charge of the football operation under Jeffrey Lurie. But he's one of the few. How many general managers today can you name and say wow, they're football people.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I would say, yeah, that's really hard to say. I don't follow the general managers as much as I do the coaching staff and the players. Um, I did want to
Well, the other,
ask you. Oh, go
well,
ahead.
let,
Well,
let me just add, let me just add to it is that the other thing I brought up to Mike Sando is there is always, even going way into the past, the eternal struggle between the head coach and the general manager, what each one wants for the team. Now, today, I believe that what has really evolved is, for instance, Mike Vrabel is the head coach here. I think he has a lot more authority than the head coach. You know that they don't have a general manager here. They have different titles for different people here, but it's so huge and diverse. And now they've added their own analytics department. But if you ask me, who's the guy that really influences everything here, it would be the head coach. And I think you're seeing more and more of that. I mean, look at even the 70s. Shula really ran everything in Miami. I mean, he had personnel directors. I actually recommended Bobby Beathard to him when he was looking for a personnel director when Joe Thomas left to go to run the Baltimore Colts. And Bobby Beathard is now in the Hall of Fame. But again, coaches, would you say Bill Parcells was in charge? Would you say Don Shula was in charge? When you look around at the NFL today, how many general managers are really in charge? Who do you really look at that really kind of runs things? There's no question that Bill Belichick was in charge here. He was everything here.
same with
So
Vince Lombardi with the Packers, Paul
absolutely.
Brown, Paul Brown with Cleveland. But I wanted to ask you when you got to the Colts in 1960, I think it was Don Kellett was the general manager,
He was.
and then at that time when you got there, Weeb Eubank was the head coach, and then Eubank was fired a couple seasons later, and Don Shula was hired. Could you kind of talk about what was Don Kellett's role like? What was his relationship with Shula, and kind of give us some insight about his what the general manager was with the Colts, with Shula as
Well,
head coach and Eubank and then Carroll Rosenblum as the owner.
a little history on Don Kellett. Don Kellett was the ultimate general manager in that era, and particularly with the Colts. He signed the players. He kind of, they didn't really have a drafting department in the beginning, and they moved over Keith Molesworth when they fired him as head coach, and then Weeb came in into what was then some form of a scouting department. But the backstory on Kellett is pretty interesting. I remember going in the 40s to Penn games as a kid, Penn basketball games. He was the head basketball coach at Penn. He then became a television executive in Philly, and Rosenblum, who we really relied on my father for as much advice as possible, because my father was the one that convinced him to be the owner to come back into Baltimore when they had failed a couple of times. And ironically, my father was Rosenblum's coach at Penn when Rosenblum was really a good running back at Penn and was going to go to Notre Dame with Marty Brill, who became famous by leaving Penn and going to Notre Dame and coming back and beating the University of Pennsylvania. Anyway, Rosenblum was going to go with Marty Brill to Notre Dame. My father said to him, stopped him and said, "Don't do this." He said, your father's business interests are in Baltimore, in the Philadelphia area. Don't leave. Stay here. And so Rosenblum decided on my father's advice as his coach to stay at the University of Pennsylvania. And then when it came time to bring a team back to Baltimore, He knew Rosenblum had the money, but he had to convince him. Rosenblum said, "This is this is the worst investment I could think of." And my father said, "Someday down the road, you'll be happy." So Rosenblum then would call my father and say, "Well, I'm looking for a general manager." He said, "I got just the guy for you." Now, why did he pick Kellett? Well, Kellett came to him as a TV executive when the Dallas Texans had failed, which eventually became the Baltimore Colts, and said, "I have this idea, Bert." He said that the team could train in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and he said then they could play every game on the road. And so he set up this whole thing, made the presentation to my father. My father said, "I like it." That's what my father used with and there's a book out on it now that I'm in that book on the Dallas Texans and how they eventually became the Baltimore Colts. But when Rosenblum was hired for looking for a general manager, my father said to him, "The guy was a basketball coach. He knows football. He knows television, which is the future of the game. Here's your guy." Rosenblum hired Kellett, and Kellett, I would say, if it was today, he'd be in the Hall of Fame. I mean, he hired Weave Eubank. He put together a terrific team. They signed, quarterbacks. I mean, they found Unitas. They had great drafts. They did everything. But he ran it all. He said to me when I was my first year there, he said, "Uppy," he said, "in those days, the ticket office is the heart of a team." They weren't getting big television money at that time. He said, "The more tickets we sell, the better we are." He said, "You start out at the ticket office, and then you work your way up." And of course, he ran really everything, and that was the general manager of football at the time. And then it evolved, as we saw. And you had the Jim Finkses, and you had people like that. Tex Schramm, Pete Rozelle. And then Schramm goes to the Cowboys. And then Schramm hires Tom Landry. And as you say, Lombardi was totally in charge there. But in Green Bay. And then Edward Bennett Williams hires him in Washington. And then who's he hire after that? George Allen. And I remember after I got fired here, George Allen called me. Two teams called me. And Allen brought me down. And he said, "Well, I'm looking for an assistant." I thought to myself after the interview, "Ain't no way I'm going to be an assistant here." He runs everything, and I'm going to have no say whatsoever. So
Now,
basically,
in one case where you did have all the say, was when you owned the Charlotte Hornets. Now, what was that of the World Football League? And for those of you who don't know the history of the World Football League, just quickly, that was a league that was set up in the mid '70s to compete with the NFL. It signed some of its biggest stars, Hall of Famers. Paul Warfield and Larry Zonka famously went from the Dolphins to the World Football League. Upton, you own the World Football League's Charlotte Hornets. What was that organizational setup, and who was the general manager there? Did you have a general manager, and what was their role like?
I was everything. I was the owner, the general manager, the ticket taker, everything. Although I had a really good, it was small, but a really good front office. What I had decided after my experience with the Patriots, coming from the Colts where we won all the time, and going to the Patriots where it just seemed impossible, I said, "You know what? I even if it doesn't make it, even if I lose most of my money or whatever I had, I want the experience of what it is like to bring my own ideas, to have to answer to nobody, bring my own ideas into a football team, and what I wanted to do was experiment in every which way with all the things that I'd learned from my father all the way through on from Don Kellett, from Carol Rosenblum, to running a football team. And I would say in the almost 2 years that I was there, even though the league didn't make it, and I knew going in there was a chance that it might not make it. But what I got out of it is how to really run a football team, how to run a sports enterprise, how to deal with every different problem from players to coaches to whatever you think it is. In fact, the first thing that one of the first things that happened is there was a television station. I sold all the radio rights to a CBS outlet there, but there's a television station in Charlotte called WRET. Guess who owned it? The immortal Ted Turner. So Ted Turner came to town. They called me and said, would you meet with Ted Turner? I said, what do you think? I'll go to Atlanta to meet with him. What the hell are you talking about? So I met with Turner, and he said, let me tell you something. He said, and the NFL was right in the middle of what could have been a strike at that time by the players. And Turner said, I've got great plans. He said, I want to put your games on television. He said, I want to eventually have your games on all throughout the South. I own all the TV stuff. We'll run it out of Atlanta. And he said, I really think this is going to be a big thing. He said, don't worry about the NFL. He said, we can help bankroll this. We can do a lot of different things. And I really like what he had to say. But ironically, as I talked in my book, he was right in the middle of the America's Cup in Newport. And, he's a big sailor. And he said, he said, I've got this idea. He said, it'll probably be 3 or 4 years away. He said, but I want to start this all news network, this all new cable news network. And he said, I'm not sure whether it can make it or not. Ironically said, I said to him, doesn't sound like it. Of course, that's today's CNN, which is you talk about sitting for an hour and a half with a true visionary. It was Ted Turner. Came in, not a suit, sport coat, blazer, something like that. Actually, no socks. Put his feet up on the table, which I loved. I mean, I loved the whole idea of it. I said, these are the type of people, because television, even going all the way back to my father, he said television is our future. It's the perfect game for television, which it still is today. And Turner saw that whole thing, and I thought to myself, this is the future if we can hang on. And of course, we weren't. I mean, Sonica Kick and Warfield went to Memphis with John Bassett, and they were really, we signed a lot of NFL players. I decided not to do that. I went and hired a guy that eventually got fired, but would have been a great NFL head coach, Bob Gibson. And Bob Gibson, the minute the league went down, Bob Gibson and 90% of my players were signed to NFL contracts. He eventually went to the Giants, and unfortunately, he called that play where instead of the quarterback falling on the football, running out the clock.
Oh no! Oh
exactly.
no!
Yes.
Pisarek. Yep. Oh,
yeah.
And Herman Edwards scooping it up.
Yep.
Oh my! Oh my!
And that eventually caused John McVay, who went on then to the 49ers as their general manager under Bill Walsh. That cost him his job, and Gibson got fired that day. I always claim that if that hadn't happened, Gibson would have eventually been an NFL head coach. But one of my coaches did get the Packers job, and that was Lindy Infante.
I remember Lindy Infante. He was a good coach.
Yeah, damn good coach.
I would take him over Matt LaFleur, okay? Yeah. But I know I might not be popular in saying that, but But
but what my point was, my all the years that I garnered all of the things, all the information, everything, that in that short 2 year span, I did everything that I wanted to do, which was basically hire my own staff, pick my own coach, run my front office, negotiate the contracts, negotiate the TV contracts, do all those things, and yet still keep in mind we had to have a good football team, which we did. When the league went down, we weren't paying anybody. We didn't sign any big players, but I knew where to get the players. Now, our coaching staff, our first year there, Babe Perilli was head coach, and I didn't fire him. I just said, Babe, find another job. I'm going to go out and find somebody that I want, which was Bob Gibson. Um, the, the players, the coaches, every one of them got an NFL job immediately, including Lindy Infante, then being named the Packers coach, Bob Gibson going to the Giants. I mean, there was as I said, every player that we had, practically every player, including, does this name sound familiar also, the quarterback, the future quarterback of the Detroit Lions, Gary Danielson, was my quarterback.
oh yeah, and he now
He's still on TV.
a lot of people know him as a college football
Yeah,
commentator.
he's still doing it.
I think he
So,
just retired last year. I think that's going to
really,
be, yeah, I think last year was his last year. But yeah, I mean, Gary Danielson is the voice of color commentary on college football for, a couple of decades.
well,
Um,
absolutely, absolutely. But my point is, when I was left to my own devices, answering to no one, that I kind of achieved all the things that I wanted to, even if the league didn't make it. And I thought to myself, you know what? That's, as I told my biographer, Ron Borges, I said, that's it for me. I'm not, I'm not, I'm not going back. I'll go into radio and television, which I did here, and had a very good career. But I said, that was the ultimate. Do I want to go back someplace and have to listen to an owner or somebody tell me something that I don't already know? I wouldn't be in the job for 2 minutes. So that was it.
all right, and that's it for this edition of Unvarnished Football. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please visit unvarnishedfootball.com. Also, visit uptonbell.com. Learn more about Upton and find how to visit the Upton Bell collection at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And also visit the Game Before the Money. I'm Michael Jackson, and for Upton Bell, we'll catch you next Thursday.